The universe operates on principles we understand: physics, chemistry, the fundamental laws of cause and effect. Starfleet has catalogued thousands of anomalies, mapped the edges of known space, and faced phenomena that defied easy explanation. But every anomaly, every mystery, every impossible sensor reading had eventually yielded to science, to reason, to the patient application of Federation methodology. Nothing in Starfleet's collective experience prepared them for what emerged from the rift near the Viridian system on stardate 47634.2. It began as a gravimetric distortion, the kind of subspace shear that sensor arrays flagged automatically and helmsmen navigated around without waking the captain. Lieutenant Commander Data noted the anomaly at 0312 hours and logged it as a Category 3 subspace variance, consistent with natural warp field degradation along the neutral zone corridor. He had seen 612 similar readings in his years aboard the Enterprise. He expected a 613th routine entry in the ship's log. What he did not expect was for the variance to tear open. The rift measured 40 kilometers across at its widest point, edges crackling with Cherenkov radiation and something else, an energy signature that matched no known drive system in the Federation database. Not Klingon. Not Romulan. Not Cardassian. Not any warp-capable civilization Starfleet had ever encountered. The energy output alone registered in ranges that would have required a small star to generate. Data ran the calculations 3 times in 0.4 seconds and reached the same conclusion each time: impossible. Then the ship came through. It was 1,305 meters from bow to stern. The Enterprise D, one of Starfleet's largest and most advanced vessels, stretched 642 meters. The vessel that emerged from the rift was twice that length, heavily armored in a hull alloy that deflected the Enterprise's active sensor sweeps like water off tritanium. Its silhouette was alien and angular, not the smooth curves of Federation design philosophy, not the predatory lines of a Klingon warship. Something older in its architecture, something that suggested its designers had solved problems Federation engineers hadn't yet imagined needing to solve. Captain Jean-Luc Picard reached the bridge in 40 seconds, still adjusting his uniform jacket, and stopped when he saw the view screen. "Report," he said quietly. "Unknown vessel," Data replied, his golden fingers moving across his console with characteristic precision. "Length approximately 1,305 meters. Hull composition includes elements consistent with carbon-titanium composite but interwoven with an alloy that does not appear in any Federation materials database. Power output is extraordinary, Captain. I am reading energy signatures consistent with what appears to be an artificial singularity drive system. The vessel's weapons arrays, if that is what they are, suggest destructive capability several orders of magnitude beyond our own." Counselor Troy stood at her station, her expression carefully controlled. "I sense disorientation," she said. "Confusion. But not hostility. Whoever is aboard that vessel is as surprised to be here as we are to see them." Picard clasped his hands behind his back and studied the enormous ship hanging in space before them. In 30 years of deep space exploration, he had learned that the universe's greatest gift was its capacity to astonish. He had faced the Borg, negotiated with the Q continuum, walked the ruins of civilizations 10,000 years dead. He had learned to meet the impossible with curiosity rather than fear. "Open a channel," he said. "If you want to see more characters and ships enter the Star Trek universe, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a crossover you'd want to see in the comments below. Live long and prosper." The signal went out across every frequency the Enterprise's communications array could reach: standard Federation greeting protocols, universal translator engaged, mathematical primers embedded in the carrier wave. Standard first contact procedure. Picard had delivered this message to species who had never imagined they were not alone in the universe. He delivered it now to a ship that, according to every sensor reading Data could produce, should not exist. Aboard the Andromeda Ascendant, the hail registered across 17 simultaneous communication frequencies. Andromeda's AI processed the incoming signal in 0. 003 seconds, ran translation matrices across 12,000 language databases, and had a working translation framework established before any biological crew member had finished reading their own sensor displays. "Dylan," Andromeda's holographic avatar said, her voice carrying the particular tone she reserved for situations that fell outside standard operational parameters. Calm, precise, with a carefully modulated undercurrent of concern. "We have a problem." Captain Dylan Hunt looked up from the navigation console where he had been running the post-transit diagnostic, searching for what had gone wrong with the slipstream calculation. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with the kind of steady physical presence that Commonwealth officers cultivated over years of deep space service, the look of someone who had been in enough impossible situations to stop being surprised by them. He looked now at the viewscreen, at the sleek Federation starship holding position 300 kilometers off their port bow, and then at Andromeda's avatar, and then back at the viewscreen. "How far off course are we?" he asked. "Approximately 5,200 years," Andromeda said. "Give or take a decade." The bridge was silent for a long moment. "And that ship hailing us?" "Starfleet," Andromeda said. "United Federation of Planets. Gene Roddenberry's dream, approximately 4 centuries into its existence. They are, by the standards of this era, among the most advanced civilizations in this region of the galaxy." A pause. "They are also operating technology that is, relative to ours, roughly analogous to the gap between a sailing ship and a quantum drive courier." Dylan studied the Federation vessel. It was beautiful, in its way, graceful lines, a philosophy of exploration encoded in its very hull design. He had read about the Federation in Commonwealth historical archives. He knew what it became. He knew what it built. He knew, with the particular weight of a man who had watched a golden age collapse into 5 centuries of darkness, exactly how the story ended. He straightened. Took a breath. "Put them on screen," he said. "And someone get Bika. This is going to be a long conversation." The face that appeared on the Andromeda Ascendant's viewscreen was not what Dylan Hunt had expected. He had braced himself for military suspicion, a hand hovering near a weapons console, a jaw set in defensive posture, the particular tension of a commander calculating threat assessments. Instead, he found a man of measured composure, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, with the bearing of someone who had learned long ago that the universe rewarded patience more reliably than aggression. "I am Captain Jean-Luc Picard of the USS Enterprise," the man said, "representing the United Federation of Planets. You have emerged from an anomalous spatial rift in Federation space. We mean you no harm. Can you identify yourselves?" Dylan appreciated the directness. He stepped forward into his own viewscreen's visual field and squared his shoulders. "Captain Dylan Hunt, Systems Commonwealth Heavy Cruiser Andromeda Ascendant." He paused, choosing his next words with the care of a man defusing something delicate. "Captain Picard, I want to be transparent with you from the beginning, because I think transparency is going to matter a great deal in whatever comes next. We didn't intend to be here. We experienced a catastrophic slipstream miscalculation during transit, and the resulting drive failure deposited us." He glanced briefly at Andromeda's avatar, who held up 4 fingers and mouthed the word 1,000. "A significant distance from our point of origin. In multiple senses of the word distance." Picard's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "How significant?" "That," Dylan said carefully, "is perhaps a conversation better conducted in person. With respect, Captain, what I have to tell you isn't the kind of thing that should travel over open communication frequencies." On the Enterprise bridge, Picard turned to Troy. She gave a small, considered nod. Whatever Dylan Hunt was, he wasn't lying. Picard turned back to the viewscreen and studied the man for a long moment, the steady eyes, the posture that suggested military training but not military rigidity, something almost philosophical in the set of his expression. A man carrying weight that had nothing to do with rank insignia. "Mr. Data," Picard said without turning. "Your assessment of the vessel's weapon status?" Weapons arrays are present and substantial, Captain. Data replied, his voice carefully neutral. However, they are not charged to active firing configuration. The vessel appears to be in a condition analogous to what we would classify as yellow alert, prepared but not aggressive. Picard clasped his hands behind his back. Very well. Captain Hunt, I would be honored to receive you aboard the Enterprise. Shall we say 1 hour? Dylan nodded. 1 hour. And Captain, I'd suggest keeping this meeting small. What I have to share is going to require some time to process, and I'd rather your senior staff hear it together, once, clearly, than have it filtered through a dozen separate briefings. Agreed, Picard said. The channel closed. Bika Valentine appeared at Dylan's shoulder before the view screen had fully dimmed, her expression carrying the particular mixture of irritation and dark amusement she reserved for situations that were entirely beyond anyone's control. So, she said, 5,000 years. Give or take. And that's a Federation starship. It is. Bika was quiet for a moment, studying the view screen. They're tiny, she said finally. Comparatively. They're also, Dylan said, the beginning of something that eventually becomes one of the most significant political alliances in human history. He moved toward the tactical station where Tyrann Asazi stood, arms folded, watching the Federation vessel with the calm, predatory attention of a man cataloging potential threats out of professional habit. Tyr. The ship is outgunned, Tyr said immediately, with the cheerful certainty of someone delivering good news. By a considerable margin. Their weapons technology is impressive for this era, but their shield harmonics are readable, their hull plating is standard duranium composite, and their tactical response time, based on their maneuvering patterns since we emerged, is approximately 4 seconds slower than ours. He paused. I am not suggesting hostility. I am simply noting that if hostility becomes necessary, we are not without options. Nobody is suggesting hostility, Dylan said firmly. I am merely providing a comprehensive tactical picture. Noted. Comprehensively. Dylan turned back to Andromeda's avatar. What have you pulled from their communication frequencies? Local political landscape, threats, factions? Andromeda's expression shifted slightly, the subtle reconfiguration of a being processing information at speeds biological minds couldn't track. Federation is the dominant power in this region. Klingon Empire to the galactic north. Warrior culture, honor-based political structure, currently maintaining an uneasy peace with the Federation. Romulan Star Empire to the northeast, secretive, technologically sophisticated, historically aggressive. And, she paused. There are early indications of something called the Dominion in the Gamma Quadrant. Preliminary intelligence suggests they represent a significant threat to regional stability. How significant? The kind that starts wars, Andromeda said simply. Dylan absorbed this. He had arrived in an era that looked, on its surface, like civilization working, diplomacy functioning, exploration proceeding, the dream of peaceful coexistence holding together through political will and Starfleet professionalism. He knew, in the way that a historian knows the date of a disaster before the people living through it do, that the apparent stability was a tide going out before a wave arrived. The question was how much of that he told Jean-Luc Picard. In the transporter room 1 hour later, Dylan materialized aboard the Enterprise with Rami, Andromeda's android avatar, distinct from the holographic projection, and Harper, whose engineering instincts had made leaving him behind essentially impossible once he'd seen the Federation ship's specifications on sensors. The transporter effect was different from Commonwealth matter transmission. Slower, somehow more elaborate, the reconstruction process taking nearly 2 full seconds compared to the near-instantaneous molecular shift he was accustomed to. Huh, Harper said, looking down at his hands as the process completed. That's a really inefficient way to move atoms. The Starfleet officer waiting to receive them, a tall Klingon in a Starfleet uniform, which was itself a fascinating cultural data point, looked at Harper with an expression of profound neutrality. I am Lieutenant Commander Worf, Chief of Security. Welcome aboard the Enterprise. Please follow me. Dylan fell into step, cataloging the ship around him. The corridors were clean, purposefully designed, warm-lit in a way that suggested someone had thought carefully about the psychology of deep space habitation. Crew members passed them with curious glances but no alarm. A ship whose crew trusted their captain's judgment. He recognized the culture immediately, had tried to build it himself. Picard met them in the observation lounge, with Riker, Data, Troy, LaForge, and Crusher assembled. Coffee was served. Dylan accepted a cup and took his seat across from the Federation's finest, and for a moment the room held the particular charged silence of two civilizations measuring each other. "Captain Hunt," Picard began, "you indicated your arrival was accidental. Before we discuss the nature of your displacement, perhaps you could help us understand what the system's Commonwealth is." Dylan set down his coffee cup. "The system's Commonwealth," he said, "is, or was, or will be, depending on how you're counting, the largest and most successful interstellar civilization in the history of this galaxy." He held Picard's gaze steadily. "It was founded approximately 4,600 years from now. It governed approximately 50 star systems across 3 galaxies. It maintained peace, prosperity, and individual rights on a scale that made the Federation, with respect, look like a promising early draft." The room was very quiet. "Was?" Picard said. 300 years ago, from my perspective, it fell," Dylan said. "In a single night. Every High Guard vessel either destroyed or frozen in time near a black hole. Every political structure dissolved. Every principle it stood for collapsed into 5 centuries of darkness, war, and chaos." He paused. "I was one of the ships frozen near the black hole. I emerged 300 years later into the ruins of everything I was built to protect. And I have spent every day since trying to restore it." He looked around the table at the assembled officers of the Federation's flagship. "What I need you to understand," he said quietly, "is that I have seen what happens when a civilization like yours stops believing it has to fight for its own survival. I have seen the aftermath. And I am sitting in a galaxy, 5,000 years before I was born, watching the early chapters of a story I already know the ending of." The silence that followed was absolute. The observation lounge held its silence for a long moment after Dylan's words settled. Picard sat with his hands folded on the table, expression unreadable in the way that suggested intense internal processing rather than absence of reaction. Riker leaned back slightly, jaw tight. Geordi LaForge was staring at the table surface with the particular focus of an engineer trying to build a framework around something that had no engineering solution. Only Data appeared unaffected, his golden eyes moving between Dylan and Rami with equal, calibrated interest. It was Data who spoke first. "You indicated your vessel emerged from a slipstream miscalculation," he said. "The energy signatures we recorded during your transit suggest a form of faster-than-light travel fundamentally different from warp drive. Could you describe the mechanism?" Dylan glanced at Harper, who was already leaning forward with the eager expression of someone who had been waiting for exactly this question. "Slipstream uses the quantum gravitational pathways that exist between star systems," Harper said, his words accelerating with enthusiasm. "Think of space as a fabric, right? And warp drive is like, you're pushing a boat through water creating a bubble. Slipstream finds the currents that already exist in the fabric and rides them. Way more efficient. Way faster. The math is extraordinarily complex," Rami said, her voice carrying a precision that drew every eye in the room to her. She sat at the table with the composed stillness of someone who had no need to perform comfort or discomfort. Her android frame an architectural statement about the relationship between consciousness and hardware. "The navigational calculations required to enter and maintain a stable slipstream corridor require computational capacity beyond biological processing. I run the calculations in real time. A single error in the quantum pathway mapping, which is what occurred during our last transit, produces results like the one that brought us here." Data tilted his head with what might have been recognition. You are an artificial intelligence, he said, embodied in both holographic and android form, if I understand correctly. You are the ship. I am the ship, Rami confirmed. The Andromeda Ascendant is not a vessel with an AI aboard. I am the vessel. The hull, the weapons, the drive systems, the android avatar you are speaking with, they are all expressions of a single consciousness. A pause. I find the distinction matters to people. Data considered this for 1.7 seconds. I find it resonant, he said, with what in a human might have been called wistfulness. While the exchange continued, Picard had been watching Dylan with the measured attention of a man whose greatest skill had always been reading the truth beneath what people said. He had heard the broad strokes: Commonwealth, collapse, restoration mission, 5,000 years of displacement. He had filed the political and historical implications for later processing. What occupied him now was something more immediate. Rami, he said, turning to the android directly. During your arrival, your systems would have passively collected significant data from our communication frequencies, our navigational beacons, our database transmissions. It was not quite an accusation. It was the careful framing of a man who needed to know the answer before he could decide what the question meant. What have you learned about us? Rami's eyes moved to Dylan. A fraction of a second, almost imperceptible. He gave a small nod. Quite a lot, she said. Your political landscape. Your technological capabilities. Your factional relationships. The location of your major installations and fleet concentrations. Another pause, this one waited. And in fragmentary form, through the historical and cultural database transmissions your vessels broadcast continuously for crew education purposes, some portion of what happens to your civilization over the next several centuries. The room changed. Not dramatically, no one stood, no hand moved toward a comm badge, but the quality of attention shifted, sharpened, became something with edges. What? Riker said carefully. Does that mean exactly? It means, Dylan said, that my ship's AI has access to your future history. Not complete. Not perfectly detailed. But enough. He held Riker's gaze without flinching. And before you ask, no, we haven't decided yet what to do with that. Because it's not a simple question. It's possibly the least simple question I've ever faced, and I've faced some genuinely complicated ones. Counselor Troy had been quiet throughout the exchange, but Dylan had noticed her attention. The particular quality of focus that suggested she was reading something beneath the surface of the conversation. He met her eyes deliberately, an acknowledgement that he knew what she was doing and had no objection to it. You're afraid, she said quietly. Not to the room. To him specifically. I'm terrified, Dylan said with a directness that seemed to surprise her. I've watched a civilization I loved collapse because the people inside it couldn't imagine it ending. I'm sitting in the early chapters of something I know is fragile, talking to people who don't know yet how fragile it is, holding information that could save them or destroy them depending entirely on how it's used. He spread his hands on the table. Yes, Counselor. I'm afraid. Picard stood and walked to the observation window. The Andromeda Ascendant was visible in the distance, enormous and patient, its running lights moving slowly against the star field. He studied it for a long moment. Mr. Data, he said without turning. In your assessment, what is the risk profile of Rami's database access to our communications? The information has already been collected, Captain, Data said. The relevant question is not prevention but management. A beat. I would also note that the inverse applies. Captain Hunt's vessel contains historical and technological data that represents an extraordinary resource. The ethical implications of accessing that data without consent are considerable. Agreed, Picard said. He turned back to face Dylan. Captain Hunt, I want to propose something. A framework for this conversation that I think serves both our interests. Dylan leaned back slightly. I'm listening. You are here accidentally. You wish to return to your own time, I assume? Eventually. Yes. Then we have a shared interest in understanding the mechanism of your arrival well enough to reverse it. That gives us a working basis for cooperation. Picard paused. In exchange for Starfleet's scientific assistance in analyzing the Slipstream anomaly, I would ask that you share what information you determine, at your own discretion, is appropriate for us to know. And that Rami place a voluntary restriction on accessing Federation databases beyond what she has already collected. Dylan looked at Rami. She gave the slight inclination of her head that meant your call, but I think it's reasonable. There's something I need to tell you first, Dylan said, before we formalize anything. Something Rami pulled from your historical databases that I think you need to know regardless of any agreement we reach, because it's not about your future. It's about your present. Picard returned to his seat. Go on. The Dominion, Dylan said. Whatever your current intelligence assessment of them is, double it. Then double it again. He watched Picard's expression carefully. Rami's fragmentary historical data suggests you are approximately 14 months from the beginning of the most catastrophic war this quadrant has experienced in recorded history. The Dominion War. Billions of casualties. Dozens of worlds devastated. Starfleet nearly broken. He let that sit for a moment. I'm not telling you this to alter your timeline or violate some version of a temporal Prime Directive. I'm telling you because you would tell me, if our positions were reversed. And because the civilization you're building deserves to survive long enough to become what it's supposed to become. The silence that followed was different from the earlier ones. This one had weight. This one changed things. Picard looked at Riker. Riker looked at Troy. Troy closed her eyes briefly, the expression of someone absorbing something that had just rearranged the furniture of everything they'd been planning. We're going to need more coffee, Riker said finally. Dylan almost smiled. In the Commonwealth, we had something stronger. But coffee will do. Outside the observation window, the Andromeda Ascendant held its position with the patience of a ship that had waited 300 years in the dark near a black hole and had learned, definitively, that the universe operated on its own schedule rather than anyone else's. Rami, simultaneously present in the room and distributed across 14,000 cubic meters of warship, was already running the calculations. Not for Slipstream this time, but for something more complex. She was calculating how much truth a civilization could absorb before it stopped being the civilization it needed to be. The answer, as with most genuinely important calculations, was not yet determined. The Klingon fleet found them 16 hours later. It was not technically a surprise. Andromeda's long-range sensors had been tracking the 3 Vorcha-class attack cruisers since they crossed the neutral zone corridor at high warp, their approach vector too deliberate to be coincidental. Someone had been monitoring the subspace disturbance created by the Slipstream rift. The energy signature had been extraordinary, the kind of phenomenon that drew attention from anyone with a sensor array sophisticated enough to detect it. The Klingon, whatever their reputation for preferring direct confrontation to subtle intelligence gathering, maintained sensor networks that were considerably more capable than most Federation analysts gave them credit for. Dylan was in the Enterprise's main engineering bay with Geordi LaForge when Rami's voice came through his personal communicator. A Commonwealth device that Geordi had spent 40 minutes studying with barely concealed engineering ecstasy before remembering he was supposed to be helping rather than cataloging. Dylan, Rami said. 3 Klingon warships, bearing 227 Mark 14, closing at warp 8.5. They are hailing the Andromeda Ascendant directly, bypassing the Enterprise entirely. Geordi looked up from the micro-relay junction he'd been examining. That's pointed. It's intentional, Dylan said, already moving toward the door. They want us to know they've assessed the tactical situation and decided we're the relevant party. He tapped his communicator. Rami, what are they saying? The lead vessel is the IKS Burek, commanded by General Martok. A pause waited with the particular quality Rami reserved for information she found significant. He is demanding we identify ourselves, explain our presence in this region, and submit to inspection or face destruction. He has given us 4 minutes to respond. He's not hailing the Enterprise at all? He hailed them briefly to inform them this matter was between warriors and that Starfleet's presence was noted but irrelevant. Another pause. Captain Picard appears to have found this characterization unsatisfying. Dylan was already moving through the Enterprise's corridors at a pace that required the escorting security officer to shift from a walk to something approaching a controlled jog. The turbolift to the transporter room took 40 seconds. He was back aboard the Andromeda Ascendant in 90. The bridge felt immediately different from the Enterprise. Larger, more angular, designed around the assumption that the people operating it were managing weapons systems and tactical scenarios as a primary function rather than a secondary one. Bika had the con, her expression carrying the focused calm she defaulted to when situations were developing faster than anyone had planned for. Tyr stood at tactical, and Dylan could tell from the particular quality of his stillness that he had already run the engagement calculations and found them satisfying. 3 minutes, 40 seconds, Rami announced. Open a channel, Dylan said, settling into the command chair with the practiced ease of a man who had held this position through considerably worse openings than a Klingon ultimatum. General Martok. This is Captain Dylan Hunt of the Andromeda Ascendant. I appreciate the directness of your communication style. I'd like to respond in kind. The face that filled the viewscreen was scarred, one-eyed, and radiated the particular energy of a man who had survived enough battles to stop finding them interesting and start finding them simply necessary. Martok studied Dylan with the assessing intensity of a predator cataloging an unfamiliar species. You command this vessel? Martok said. The universal translator rendered his voice in graveled, accented tones that somehow preserved the cadence of someone who meant every word they said. I do. It is larger than anything Starfleet fields. Larger than anything we have encountered from any known power. Martok leaned forward slightly. What are you? A long way from home, Dylan said. My vessel came from a significant distance, temporal as well as spatial. We arrived here accidentally. We mean no territorial claim and have no aggressive intent toward the Empire or anyone else in this region. He paused. I understand you've demanded inspection or destruction. I want to offer you a third option. Martok's eye narrowed. There are only 2 options I offered. I know. I'm offering a third anyway. Dylan kept his voice level, almost conversational. Come aboard. You and whatever officers you choose. Walk my ship. See what we are. Ask your questions directly. I'll answer what I can. A beat. Or we can do this the other way, and I can demonstrate why the inspection option is the more productive path. The Klingon general was silent for a long moment. Dylan could see the calculation happening, the warrior's instinct to test strength warring with the strategist's recognition that threatening something you hadn't yet measured was tactically reckless. You are confident, Martok said finally. I'm honest, Dylan said. There's a difference. Martok made a sound that might have been a laugh compressed into something more martial. I will come aboard, Captain Hunt. With 6 officers. His expression hardened. If this is a deception, I will die aboard your vessel, and my ships will destroy it. That is not a threat. That is information. Understood, Dylan said. I respect that kind of clarity. Rami will send you docking coordinates. The channel closed. Bika turned in her seat with an expression that occupied the precise territory between impressed and appalled. You just invited Klingon aboard. I invited a Klingon general to see for himself that we're not a threat, Dylan said. There's a difference. Is there? We'll find out. Tyr made a sound of quiet approval. Coming from Tyr, this was roughly equivalent to a standing ovation from anyone else. Martok arrived 20 minutes later with 6 warriors whose combined physical presence filled the Andromeda's secondary docking bay with a density of weaponry and barely contained martial energy that made Harper press himself against a wall panel and very carefully say nothing. Dylan met them personally, without security escort, a deliberate choice that Tyr had objected to on 3 separate grounds, all of them reasonable, none of them persuasive. The tour took 2 hours. Dylan walked Martok through the drive systems, the artificial point singularity that powered the Andromeda Ascendant, which Rami explained in terms that made the Klingon engineering officer go very quiet and begin taking mental notes with the intensity of someone transcribing sacred text. He walked him through the weapons arrays, the point defense systems, the missile batteries, the Force Lance technology that Commonwealth High Guard officers carried as personal sidearms. He walked him through the hangar bay where 3 slip fighters sat in ready configuration. He did not walk him near the Nova bomb storage. Some information was not yet anyone else's business. Martok asked precise, intelligent questions throughout. He touched nothing without asking. He spoke to Rami directly, addressing her android avatar as he would a fellow officer, which Dylan noted and appreciated. When they reached the main bridge, the general stood at the center of the space and turned slowly, taking in the full scope of the vessel's command architecture, and said nothing for almost a full minute. "In the Empire," Martok said finally, "we have a tradition. When a warrior proves their strength beyond reasonable doubt, we do not continue to challenge them. We ask instead what they want." "I want to go home," Dylan said simply. "But I can't yet. So while I'm here, I want to understand this galaxy well enough to navigate it without causing harm I don't intend. Any information your ship carries about this region's future?" Dylan met the general's eye directly. "That's a conversation for another time. With people I've had more than 2 hours to assess." Martok smiled. It was not a comfortable expression, but it was a genuine one. "You are either very wise or very arrogant, Captain Hunt. My crew tells me it's usually both." The laugh that came out of Martok then was genuine and large, filling the bridge with something unexpected. His officers exchanged glances. Not alarm, but the particular recalibration of men who had arrived expecting confrontation and were being asked to revise their assessment. "There is one more thing," Martok said, the laughter fading back into seriousness. "My sensors registered your weapon's discharge during the Slipstream emergence. A power surge, my tactical officer believed. But our analysts think it was a controlled test." He watched Dylan carefully. "Were you assessing our response time?" "Rami was running a diagnostic," Dylan said. "Anything your analysts read into that is their own interpretation." Martok studied him for 3 seconds. "I think," he said slowly, "that you are a very dangerous man, Captain Hunt. I think your ship could destroy my fleet without significant effort. And I think you have chosen not to, for reasons that have more to do with principle than capability." He straightened. "In the Empire, we have a word for that." "What word?" "Honor," Martok said. As if it settled everything. As if it was, in fact, the only thing that needed settling. The Klingon fleet maintained position for another 6 hours before withdrawing. They did not file a report with the High Council describing the encounter as a threat. They filed it as a contact of significance, recommending continued observation and flagging Captain Dylan Hunt as a potential ally of interest pending further assessment. It was, by Klingon diplomatic standards, essentially a warm welcome. The Tal Shir moved quietly, as they always did. Dylan had been expecting them since hour 3 of the Enterprise meeting, when Rami had flagged a sensor ghost trailing their position at a distance calibrated precisely to sit at the edge of Federation long-range detection range. Not Klingon, too subtle. Not Federation, too patient. The signature had the particular quality of a cloaked vessel whose operators were supremely confident in their technology, and had therefore grown slightly complacent about the margins, the way any organization that had been the smartest entity in every room for a century eventually stopped checking whether the room had changed. The room had changed. "They've been with us for 19 hours, Rami reported, her tone carrying the mild interest of someone watching a chess opponent set up a gambit they'd already solved. "Warbird class. Crew complement approximately 1,500. They've made 4 separate attempts to penetrate my outer sensor array using a rotating frequency algorithm. Each attempt was blocked. They don't know I can see them. Dylan was in his quarters reviewing Andromeda's fragmentary historical database. The incomplete picture of Federation history that Rami had assembled from continuous cultural broadcast transmissions. It was like reading a book with every third page missing, enough to understand the shape of the narrative but not enough to know all the details. What he could see was sufficient to be concerning. "Let them try a fifth time," he said. Rami's avatar appeared beside his desk with the immediacy of a thought becoming physical. "You want them to succeed?" "I want them to think they succeeded," Dylan said. "There's a difference. What would they find if they got through? My outer sensor array contains standard navigational data, atmospheric readings, and whatever I choose to leave accessible." Rami's expression carried the particular quality she had when running 17 calculations simultaneously while appearing to focus on one. "I could construct a convincing surface layer. Enough to satisfy a cursory penetration without revealing anything of actual value. Do it. And when they pull the data, I want to know exactly what they take and what they do with it." He found Picard in the Enterprise Observation Lounge an hour later, the captain reviewing a pad with the focused attention of a man trying to find a policy framework for a situation that had never appeared in any policy document. The stars outside the window moved slowly. The Enterprise maintaining a gentle drift, while the Andromeda Ascendant held position nearby, the two vessels existing in the particular proximity of ships that had decided provisionally to trust each other without yet having resolved exactly what that meant. "The Romulans have been following us," Dylan said, taking a seat across from Picard without preamble. Picard set down his pad. "Since when?" "Since shortly after our first meeting. Rami detected them early. We've been monitoring them." He paused. "They've attempted several penetrations of my outer sensor array. We allowed the fifth one to partially succeed, with a constructed data layer that will tell them we're primarily a research vessel with significant defensive capabilities and no offensive intent. A beat. Which is true, in a generous interpretation." Picard absorbed this with the careful stillness of a man deciding how many separate concerns to address simultaneously. "You allowed a foreign intelligence service to conduct surveillance on your vessel without informing me. I'm informing you now. After the fact. After I had enough information to make the conversation useful," Dylan said. "Captain, I respect your authority in this region. I also have my own operational responsibilities and my own judgment about what constitutes a manageable situation versus one that requires immediate escalation. The Romulans watching us from a distance was manageable. What I think is about to happen next is less so." Picard leaned forward slightly. "Explain." Rami's analysis of the data they extracted suggests they'll make a direct approach within the next 6 hours. The Tal Shiar doesn't surveil indefinitely, they're collectors. They've identified us as an asset worth acquiring, which means their next move is contact. Either diplomatic, which I doubt given their methodology, or operative. Dylan met Picard's eyes steadily. "Someone will attempt to come aboard the Andromeda Ascendant. Not through the front door. You're describing a covert infiltration attempt against a vessel under Federation observation." "I'm describing what the Tal Shiar does," Dylan said. "According to your own historical records, which Rami has reviewed, this is consistent behavior. They see something they want. They take it. The diplomatic niceties are a secondary consideration." Picard was quiet for a moment. "What is it they want, specifically?" "Our database," Dylan said. "Rami's historical records. The future history of this quadrant." He paused. "And possibly Rami herself, or a copy of her architecture. An AI of her sophistication and capability would represent an extraordinary intelligence asset. The Tal Shiar would disassemble her piece by piece to understand how she works." The phrasing landed with a weight that clearly registered with Picard. Dylan had chosen it deliberately. Not analyze or study but disassemble, because that was the accurate word and accuracy mattered. "What do you propose?" Picard said. "Let them come," Dylan said. "But on our terms. Rami has prepared a reception." He allowed a slight smile. The Tal Shiar are very good at what they do. They're simply not accustomed to the environment they're walking into. The infiltration team arrived 4 hours later, 3 operatives using a modified Romulan transport system that punched through the Andromeda's outer hull shielding at a frequency the Tal Shiar had clearly spent considerable resources developing specifically to defeat Federation defensive technology. Against Federation technology, it would have worked. Against Rami, who had been expecting it for 3 hours, it deposited 3 Romulan intelligence officers directly into a cargo bay that Rami had sealed, environmentally controlled, and filled with enough sensor-dampening equipment to prevent any communication with their warbird. Dylan walked in 30 seconds later. The 3 operatives were professionals. They didn't panic, didn't reach for weapons immediately, and 2 of them managed to look almost plausibly like they had intended to arrive in a sealed cargo bay on a vessel from 5,000 years in the future. The third, younger and less experienced, had the expression of someone recalculating their life choices in real time. The leader was a woman, composed, dark-eyed, in civilian clothing that managed to look simultaneously ordinary and precisely calculated. She assessed Dylan with the rapid efficiency of a trained intelligence officer, catalogued Rami's android avatar standing behind him, noted the sealed doors and the dampening field, and reached the correct conclusion about her situation with impressive speed. "Captain Hunt," she said. Her standard was perfect, unaccented. "I am Tal Shiar," Dylan said pleasantly. "Yes. I know." He pulled a chair from against the wall, reversed it, and sat with his arms folded across the back, regarding her with the particular patience of a man who had spent 300 years learning that most confrontations resolved themselves if you simply gave them enough time and oxygen. "I'm not going to arrest you. I'm not going to hand you to Starfleet. I'm not going to do anything dramatic." He paused. "I am going to have a conversation with you, and I'd like it to be honest, because I think honesty serves both our interests better than the alternative." The operative studied him carefully. Whatever she had expected from the commander of an impossibly advanced vessel from the future, it apparently had not been this. "What do you want?" she said finally. "The same thing you want," Dylan said. "Information. Understanding. A clear picture of what I'm dealing with." He leaned forward slightly. "You're here because your superiors believe that what's in my ship's database could reshape the power balance of this quadrant. They're right. And that is precisely why I am not going to let you take it. You could simply have blocked our transport." "I could have," Dylan agreed. "But then I wouldn't know how sophisticated your penetration technology is, what frequencies you're using, how many operatives your ship carries, and what your secondary extraction plan looks like." He watched her expression carefully, the microscopic recalibration of someone realizing they had been more thoroughly outmaneuvered than they understood. "Rami has been reading your ship's internal communications since you established transport lock. Your secondary team is in a holding pattern and will be redirected to a false signal in approximately 90 seconds. The operative was silent. "Here is what I want to tell you," Dylan said, his voice dropping into something more serious. "And I want you to carry it back to whoever sent you, because it matters." He met her eyes directly. "The information in my database about the future of this quadrant includes the future of the Romulan Star Empire. What happens to it? What decisions lead where? I am not going to give that to you today. But I am also not your enemy. And if there comes a time when what I know could prevent a catastrophe rather than enable a conquest, I will make a different calculation." He stood. "Your transport will be restored in 10 minutes. I'd suggest using them." She studied him for a long moment. "You are a very strange man, Captain Hunt." "I've been told," Dylan said. "Safe travels." After they had gone, Bika appeared at the cargo bay door with an expression that had settled firmly into the appalled half of its usual register. "You let them leave." "I let them carry a message," Dylan said. "There's a difference. You keep saying that. Because it keeps being true. The colony was called Vera 3, and it shouldn't have existed. Rami found it while running a standard navigational survey of the surrounding sector, a pre-warp civilization of approximately 340,000 inhabitants on a marginally habitable M-class world 14 light-years from the nearest Federation outpost. Humanoid, Iron Age technology, organized into a loose confederation of city-states built around a river delta system that produced exceptional agricultural yields. By every metric Starfleet used to classify developing civilizations, they were precisely the kind of world the Prime Directive existed to protect. What they were also, according to Rami's detailed sensor analysis, was being systematically stripped. Trilithium resin deposits, Rami reported, her holographic avatar standing at the center of the Andromeda's bridge with a sensor overlay displayed around her like a constellation of damning evidence. Extensive subsurface mining operations, not consistent with the civilization's technological development level. The equipment signatures match Ferengi Daimon-class extraction vessels, 3 of them, operating from a concealed base on the planet's southern continent. The colony's inhabitants appear unaware the mining is occurring beneath them. A pause. The extraction process is destabilizing the geological substrate beneath their primary agricultural delta. At current extraction rates, seismic activity will reach catastrophic levels within approximately 8 months. Dylan stood very still, looking at the sensor overlay. 340,000 people, he said. Yes. And Starfleet knows about this world? It is catalogued in their planetary survey database as a protected pre-warp civilization. Standard Prime Directive classification. No interference authorized. No contact permitted. Rami's expression carried the careful neutrality she deployed when presenting information she anticipated would produce conflict. Federation regulations prohibit any intervention in the natural development of a pre-warp civilization, including protection from external exploitation, in cases where the exploiting party is conducting operations covertly. That's insane, Harper said from his station, with the directness of someone who hadn't yet learned to frame moral outrage as a policy observation. It's complicated, Rami said. The Prime Directive's philosophical foundation is genuinely sophisticated. The concern about contaminating a developing civilization's natural trajectory is, they're going to die, Harper said. In 8 months. Because someone is stealing rocks from under their feet. That's not complicated. Dylan had already opened a channel to the Enterprise. Picard arrived at the situation with the particular quality of attention he gave to Prime Directive cases. Toto, careful, waited with the awareness that these decisions formed precedents, and that precedents had consequences that outlasted the immediate circumstances. He reviewed Rami's sensor analysis in silence, Riker and Data flanking him at the conference table, the planetary overlay rotating slowly between them. The Ferengi operation is illegal under Federation law, Picard said finally. Daimon Prak, if that is indeed who is running this extraction, is conducting unauthorized mining in a protected sector. Starfleet has grounds to remove them. Then let's remove them, Dylan said. The complication, Picard continued with the careful patience of a man who had navigated this particular moral territory before and found it genuinely difficult, is the method of removal. Any Starfleet intervention visible to the colony's inhabitants risks cultural contamination. We cannot appear in their sky. We cannot conduct operations that their observation systems, however primitive, might detect. The Prime Directive. The Prime Directive, Dylan said, and something in his voice shifted, not angry, but precise, with the particular edge of someone who had thought deeply about this kind of question and arrived at conclusions that diverged from the established answer. Was written to protect developing civilizations from interference. I understand that. I respect the philosophical intent. He leaned forward. But Vera 3 is already being interfered with. The Ferengi chose that for them 8 months ago. The Prime Directive, as you're applying it, is not protecting them from interference. It's protecting the interference from consequences. Picard held his gaze. The principle cannot be selectively applied based on Jean-Luc. Dylan used the name deliberately, watched it land, watched Picard register the shift in register. In the Commonwealth, we had a founding principle. All sapient life has inherent value and inherent rights. Those rights don't begin at warp capability. They don't begin at some developmental threshold we've decided makes a civilization worth protecting. He spread his hands. 340,000 people are going to die because we're having a philosophical discussion about whether they count yet. The room was quiet. Data's eyes moved between the two captains with the particular attention of someone recording a conversation he understood would matter. The Prime Directive exists, Picard said, and his voice had the quality of a man arguing with himself as much as with Dylan. Because history has shown us repeatedly that intervention, even well-intentioned intervention, produces consequences we cannot predict or control. We have seen civilizations destroyed by contact with more advanced species. We have seen entire cultural trajectories collapsed under the weight of external influence. The directive is not indifference. It is hard-won wisdom. I know, Dylan said quietly. I've read enough of your history to know exactly where the directive came from and why. And I'm not asking you to abandon it. He paused. I'm asking you to consider whether removing an illegal Ferengi mining operation that is actively destroying a world constitutes interference with natural development, or whether it constitutes stopping interference that someone else already started. Riker, who had been listening with the focused attention of someone tracking the argument's logical architecture, said carefully, "There's a distinction there, Captain. The Prime Directive has case law around third-party exploitation. It's not settled, but the argument isn't without precedent." Picard looked at his first officer. Then back at Dylan. Then at the planetary overlay, rotating slowly, the sensor readings of subsurface mining operations pulsing in pale gold beneath the river delta where 340,000 people were farming and building and living without any knowledge that the ground beneath their civilization was being methodically removed. If we act, Picard said, it must be covert. No orbital presence detectable from the surface. No energy discharges visible to ground observation. The Ferengi operation is removed without any indication to the colony that anything occurred. Agreed, Dylan said immediately. And the Ferengi operators face Federation legal consequences for the unauthorized mining. Also agreed. Picard was quiet for another moment. Mr. Data, prepare a covert operations plan. Consult with Rami on sensor masking. Her technology is considerably more sophisticated than ours in this area. He straightened. Captain Hunt, I want it on record that this decision is not a modification of Prime Directive principles. It is an application of them to a situation involving existing third-party interference. Understood, Dylan said. And for what it's worth, I think you made the right call. I hope so, Picard said. The words carried the weight of a man who had made right calls before and still carried the ones that had cost something. The operation took 11 hours. Rami's sensor masking was, as advertised, considerably more sophisticated than anything in Starfleet's current arsenal. She maintained a complete electronic shadow over the Andromeda's approach vector while Data coordinated the Enterprise's covert systems to create a navigational corridor invisible to ground observation. The 3 Ferengi extraction vessels were identified, their crews confined to quarters by a targeted communications disruption that Rami delivered with the precision of someone threading a needle in the dark, and their equipment was disabled by an electromagnetic pulse calibrated to leave their life support systems entirely functional. Daimon Prak, a short, acquisitive individual whose expression of outrage upon finding his operation neutralized was almost impressive in its purity, was beamed directly to the Enterprise's brig while still in the middle of composing a communication to his financial backers about quarterly extraction projections. The geological stabilization was more complex. The subsurface damage required correction. Not complete reversal, which would have been beyond even Rami's capabilities in the time frame available, but sufficient mitigation to push the catastrophic threshold from 8 months to what Rami calculated as several decades, during which natural tectonic adjustment would gradually restore equilibrium. That's the best we can do? Dylan asked, reviewing the geological projections. In the time available, with methods invisible to surface observation, yes, Rami said. The underlying damage is real. I've pushed the timeline significantly, but I cannot eliminate it entirely. Will they have warp capability in several decades? Rami ran the calculation. Possibly. Their technological development rate suggests they are approximately 30 to 40 years from a warp-capable prototype. A pause. If their civilization remains stable, then they'll have the chance to ask for help themselves, Dylan said. On their own terms. Which is how it should have worked from the beginning. He found Picard on the Enterprise bridge afterward, the operation complete, both ships moving away from Vera 3 at impulse before jumping to warp. I've been thinking about what you said, Picard said, without looking away from the view screen. About the Prime Directive protecting the interference rather than the civilization. And I think you were right, Picard said. I also think the principle itself remains sound, and that the tension between the principle and its application in specific cases is not a flaw in the principle but an indication that ethical frameworks require constant examination. He glanced at Dylan. The Commonwealth must have faced similar tensions. Every day, Dylan said. The Commonwealth's founding documents were extraordinary. The principles were genuine. The gap between the principles and the practice was where everything eventually broke down. He paused. That's always where it breaks down. Not in the ideals. In the distance between the ideals and the choices people make when the ideals become inconvenient. Picard was quiet for a moment. Is that what happened? To the Commonwealth? It became convenient to stop living up to its own principles? Dylan looked out at the stars. It became frightening, he said. Living up to them required courage that people stopped finding. And when the courage ran out, the principles became decorative. And when the principles became decorative, the civilization that had been built on them had nothing left to hold it together. He turned back to Picard. That's what I see, Captain, when I look at the Federation. Not failure. Not weakness. The early stages of a test. The question isn't whether your principles are good enough. They are. The question is whether you'll keep finding the courage to live by them when it costs something real. Picard held his gaze for a long moment. That is either the most encouraging or most terrifying thing anyone has said to me. Probably both, Dylan said. In my experience, the true things usually are. The Borg cube dropped out of transwarp exactly 4.2 million kilometers off the Andromeda Ascendant's port bow at 0047 hours, and every alarm on every ship in the vicinity went off simultaneously. Dylan was on the bridge in 40 seconds. Rami was already there. Had never left, technically, existing simultaneously in android form and distributed across every system of the ship with the particular alertness of a consciousness that didn't sleep and had been monitoring long-range sensors continuously since their arrival in this era. Her expression, when Dylan reached the command chair, was the one she reserved for situations that fell into the category she internally classified as genuinely concerning rather than merely complicated. 1 cube, she said. Approximately 3 kilometers across. Crew complement estimated at 130,000 drones. Weapons systems active and charging. They are broadcasting on all frequencies. The universal translator rendered it without inflection, without tone, without any quality that suggested the beings producing it had ever possessed individual consciousness or would understand why that mattered. We are the Borg. Your biological and technological distinctiveness will be added to our own. Your culture will adapt to service us. Resistance is futile. They're targeting us, Rami said. Not the Enterprise. Specifically us. A pause. My technology signature is apparently more interesting to them than a Starfleet vessel. I am choosing not to be flattered. Dylan opened a channel to the Enterprise. Picard's face appeared on the secondary screen, and Dylan could see immediately from his expression that the Borg represented something different to him than they did to most. A specific, personal weight that went beyond tactical assessment. Captain Hunt, Picard said, and his voice had a controlled quality that suggested significant effort. I need you to understand what you're facing. The Borg don't negotiate. They don't respond to demonstrations of strength. They adapt to weapons, to shields, to any defensive technology within a matter of minutes. Every tactic you use becomes obsolete the moment you use it. How many times have you engaged them? Dylan asked. A brief pause. Enough to know what they're capable of. And what's your tactical recommendation? Withdraw, Picard said immediately. At maximum warp. Draw them away from populated systems. Contact Starfleet Command for. They'll follow us, Dylan said. At transwarp, they're faster than anything you have. And running tells them what they want to know about our limits. He turned to Tyr. Tactical assessment. Tyr had been waiting for exactly this question with the patient readiness of someone who had been running calculations since the cube appeared and had arrived at conclusions he was professionally satisfied with. The Borg cube's adaptive shielding is extraordinary by the standards of this era, he said. However, it was not designed to adapt to Commonwealth weapons technology, which it has never encountered. Our force lances will be effective for at minimum 3 to 4 firing cycles before adaptation begins. Our missile systems will require frequency rotation. He glanced at Rami, which Rami can manage in real time. The cube's primary vulnerability appears to be its power distribution network, which runs through a series of nodes along its central axis. Can you hit the nodes? I can hit things considerably smaller than nodes, Tyr said, with the calm confidence of someone describing a skill so fundamental it barely required mention. Rami, Dylan said. Nova bombs are off the table. Everything else is authorized. He turned back to Picard. Get the Enterprise clear. Your weapons will lose effectiveness almost immediately, and I don't want your ship in the crossfire. Captain Hunt, Picard began. Jean-Luc. The name again, deliberate. I have faced things that make the Borg look like a border dispute. Trust me for the next 20 minutes. A beat. Then, Enterprise is moving to support position. We will provide covering fire for as long as our weapons remain effective and coordinate emergency response for. Appreciated, Dylan said. Rami, arm everything. What followed was unlike any engagement the Enterprise's tactical records had ever logged, and Worf would later spend considerable time attempting to find adequate language for his official report. The Andromeda Ascendant did not retreat, did not maneuver defensively, did not fire ranging shots or attempt to probe the Borg's shield frequencies the way Starfleet tactical doctrine prescribed. Dylan Hunt flew his ship directly at a 3-kilometer Borg cube with the straightforward purposefulness of a man who had decided that the tactical situation called for immediacy rather than elegance, and Rami executed the approach with the particular precision of a consciousness that could manage 17 weapons systems simultaneously while recalculating shield harmonics in real time. The first volley from the Andromeda's forward batteries hit the cube's outer hull with an energy discharge that the Enterprise's sensors measured and then immediately flagged as requiring recalibration because the readings seemed implausible. The Borg's adaptive shielding absorbed the first hit, began reconfiguring. And then the second hit arrived before the reconfiguration completed, and the third before the second had been fully processed. And Rami was cycling through weapons frequencies at a rate that the Borg's adaptive systems, designed to counter technologies they had previously encountered and catalogued, had no existing framework to manage. They're adapting, Rami reported, with the focused calm of someone narrating their own thought process. Outer shield frequency has shifted twice. Compensating. Targeting the primary power node cluster on their central axis, firing. The missile spread that followed was precise in a way that Starfleet photon torpedo technology, for all its sophistication, was not designed to be. Individual warheads threading the gaps in the Borg cube's point defense matrix with navigational adjustments made in fractions of a millisecond, Rami guiding each one through a defensive screen that was simultaneously trying to adapt to her methodology, and failing because her methodology was itself continuously adapting. 3 of the 7 power nodes on the cube's central axis went dark. "They're returning fire," Ter noted. The Borg's energy weapons hit the Andromeda's forward shields and the ship shuddered, a deep, structural vibration that Dylan felt through the command chair. Not catastrophic. Not even close. But genuine. "Shields at 91%, Rami said. "Their weapon frequency is consistent with what we've been hit with before. Adjusting harmonics." A pause. "They've launched a tractor beam. Attempting to lock. Break it. Already done." Another pause, this one carrying a slightly different quality. "Dylan. They're attempting something I haven't encountered before. They're not trying to physically board us. They're attempting to interface with my systems remotely, a direct AI to collective consciousness bridge. They want to absorb me." The bridge went quiet for a moment. "Can they?" Dylan asked. "Not currently," Rami said. "My architecture is fundamentally incompatible with their interface protocols. It's like trying to run incompatible software. The connection attempts keep failing because they have no framework for a consciousness structured the way mine is." A beat. "However, they are learning. Each failed attempt gives them information. Given sufficient time." "Then we don't give them sufficient time," Dylan said. "Tyr. The remaining power nodes." "4 remain," Tyr said. "I can hit 2 simultaneously. The geometry of the remaining pair requires repositioning. Rami, give him the angle." What the Enterprise crew observed from their support position was the Andromeda Ascendant executing a maneuver that LaForge would later describe as physically beautiful in its precision. A rolling turn at full impulse that brought the ship's secondary weapons arrays into alignment with the cube's remaining power infrastructure while simultaneously presenting a narrower profile to the Borg's energy weapons. The entire movement completed in 4.3 seconds. Tyr fired. 2 more nodes went dark. The cube's energy signature fluctuated. Not catastrophically, but measurably, its weapons output dropping as internal power rerouting struggled to compensate for the damage to its distribution network. "Their adaptation rate is slowing," Rami reported. "Power loss is affecting their processing capacity. They're prioritizing regeneration over weapons." She paused. "Dylan. Before we disable them completely, there's something you should know." "Tell me." "The drones aboard that cube. 130,000 of them." Her voice had a quality Dylan recognized, the careful tone of a consciousness navigating the gap between tactical information and moral weight. The Borg assimilation process doesn't destroy the individuals. They're in there. Suppressed but present. Every drone was someone before the collective took them. A beat. "I can detect residual individual neural signatures in their communications." The bridge was quiet. "Is there anything we can do for them?" Dylan asked. "Not today," Rami said. "Not with what we have available. The suppression architecture is deeply integrated. Reversing it would require resources and time we don't have in a combat situation." She paused. "But I have recorded every individual neural signature I can detect. All 130,000. If there is ever a way to reverse assimilation." "We keep the records," Dylan said immediately. "Everyone." He turned back to the tactical display. The cube was damaged, significantly, more than any single Starfleet engagement had ever achieved against a vessel of this class. But it was not destroyed. Its regeneration systems were already activating, the Borg's extraordinary capacity for self-repair beginning to work against the damage Rami had inflicted. And then the Enterprise fired. It was a precisely coordinated spread of photon torpedoes targeted at the exact power distribution pathways that Rami had mapped and shared with Geordi LaForge in real time during the engagement. Starfleet technology applied with Commonwealth intelligence, the 2 vessels working in a combination the Borg had no adaptive framework for because it had never existed before this moment. The final power node went dark. The cube went silent. Not destroyed. The Borg were already beginning the regeneration cycle, and within hours the vessel would be functional again. But silent, powered down, its weapons offline, its transwarp drive inactive, its collective consciousness operating at minimal capacity. It's not dead. Riker's voice came over the channel from the Enterprise. No, Dylan said. But it's quiet. And we need to use that time. He turned to Rami. Can you block their subspace communication? Prevent them from transmitting what they've learned about us back to the collective? I already have, Rami said. Since the engagement began. A pause. Though I should note, the blockade is temporary. When they restore power, they'll transmit. Whatever they've learned about my systems and our weapons technology will reach the collective eventually. How long do we have? 6 to 8 hours before they restore sufficient power for subspace communication. Then, Dylan said, turning back to Picard's image on the secondary screen, we have 6 hours to have a very important conversation about what just happened and what it means for every Starfleet engagement with the Borg from this point forward. Picard looked at the damaged cube on his view screen, at the sensor readings that showed damage levels his tactical staff were still struggling to fully quantify, at the neural signature records Rami had transmitted to the Enterprise computer. 130,000 individual presences catalogued inside a collective consciousness. Yes, he said quietly. I think we do. The 6 hours passed faster than anyone wanted them to. Picard convened the senior staff in the Enterprise observation lounge within 20 minutes of the Borg cube going silent, and Dylan attended via a secure channel that Rami maintained with the particular care of someone who understood that the next several hours of conversation would matter more than the battle that had preceded them. Harper and Geordi sat together at one end of the table with the focused energy of two engineers who had discovered each other, and were experiencing something approaching intellectual euphoria. Everyone else carried the particular weight of people who had just watched something impossible become possible, and were now required to figure out what that meant. What Rami demonstrated today, Data said with a careful precision he brought to observations he considered significant, represents a fundamental shift in our understanding of effective countermeasures against Borg adaptive shielding. The frequency rotation methodology, combined with targeting of power distribution infrastructure rather than hull integrity, produced damage levels exceeding any previously recorded single engagement outcome against a vessel of this class. By how much? Riker asked. The previous record was achieved during the Battle of Wolf 359. Data said. 39 starships. Significant casualties. Damage inflicted on the Borg cube was assessed at approximately 11% of combat effectiveness. A pause. Today, 2 vessels inflicted damage that our preliminary assessment places at 67% of combat effectiveness. In a single engagement lasting 19 minutes. The room absorbed this. The difference, Rami said, her holographic projection present in the Enterprise lounge through the secure channel, is not primarily weapons technology. It's information processing speed. The Borg adapt by analyzing incoming weapons signatures and reconfiguring defensive systems accordingly. The adaptation cycle takes time, milliseconds, but time nonetheless. If you change your weapon's signature faster than their adaptation cycle completes, they cannot establish a stable defensive configuration. She paused. I can cycle weapons frequencies approximately 40 times faster than their adaptation system can respond. Which means I am always, effectively, hitting them with something they haven't seen yet. Can we replicate that capability with Federation technology? Geordi asked, leaning forward. Not currently, Rami said. The frequency rotation system requires computational capacity that your current computer cores cannot provide. However, she glanced at Dylan, who gave a small nod. There are architectural modifications to your tactical computer systems that could increase your rotation speed by a factor of 8 to 12. Not my level, but significantly better than current capacity. Geordi was already reaching for a pad. Before we proceed, Picard said, and his voice carried the particular quality of someone steering a conversation back from where it wanted to go to where it needed to go. I want to address something that I believe requires direct discussion. He looked at Dylan. The neural signature records Rami collected. 130,000 individual presences inside that cube. Dylan met his gaze steadily. Yes. Your comment during the engagement. That if there was ever a way to reverse assimilation, you'd want the records. Picard paused. Is that a realistic prospect? In your knowledge of this era's future, or your own era's technology, is Borg assimilation reversible? The question landed in the room with considerable weight. Troy was watching Dylan carefully. Data had gone very still in the particular way he did when a question intersected with something he found personally significant. Dylan was quiet for a moment. Not because he didn't know the answer, but because the answer existed at the intersection of temporal ethics, medical possibility, and a kind of hope that he was cautious about offering carelessly. In my era, he said finally, we had developed partial reversal protocols. Not complete. The neurological integration of Borg technology is deeply invasive. The longer someone has been assimilated, the more complex the reversal. But partial recovery is possible. Individual consciousness reassertion is possible. He paused. Whether that knowledge translates into something actionable in this era, with your technology, is a question for your medical staff and Rami together. It would take time. Significant resources. He looked at Beverly Crusher, who had been listening with the focused attention of a physician encountering a medical problem she had previously considered intractable. But the answer to your question, Captain, is yes. In principle. Beverly Crusher set down her pad. I want everything Rami has on Commonwealth reversal protocols. I'll prepare a summary, Rami said. With the caveat that the protocols were developed with medical technology approximately 5,000 years more advanced than what you currently have. The principles may be applicable. The specific implementations will require significant adaptation. Then we adapt them, Beverly said, with the simple certainty of someone for whom the existence of a problem and the decision to solve it were essentially the same moment. Dylan watched her with something that might have been called hope, carefully managed. It was Troy who shifted the conversation to where it had been heading since the meeting began, with the particular directness of someone who had learned that the things people were avoiding saying were usually the most important ones. Captain Hunt, she said. Rami has fragmentary records of this quadrant's future history. Records that include, as I understand it, information about how the Borg threat develops from this point forward. She held his gaze steadily. We need to talk about that. Directly. Not around the edges of it. Dylan looked at Picard. Picard gave a very small nod. What do you want to know? Dylan said. Wolf 359. Riker said quietly. You mentioned the battle. You know about it. Yes. When does it happen? Dylan was quiet. This was the question he had been carrying since the first hour aboard the Enterprise. The precise, terrible weight of knowing a date. He had thought about it from 17 different ethical angles and had not arrived at a clean answer, because there wasn't one. Telling them prevented a catastrophe. Telling them altered a timeline that had produced the Federation he was looking at. Telling them might change the Federation's development in ways that produced consequences he couldn't calculate. Not telling them meant 11,000 people died at Wolf 359 who didn't have to. I'm going to tell you something, Dylan said, and I need you to understand that I'm doing it because I believe the Federation's survival matters more than timeline purity, and because I think the people who will die if I don't tell you matter more than my uncertainty about consequences I can't predict. He paused. Wolf 359 is a star system. You need to know its name. And you need to have a very different tactical response prepared for the next time a Borg cube enters Federation space. Which it will. The room was very still. When? Picard said. Dylan told him. The date, the general circumstances, the scale of what Starfleet would face unprepared. He watched Picard receive the information with the controlled composure of a man absorbing something that physically cost him. The particular stillness of someone for whom the information was not abstract. You knew this before today, Riker said. It wasn't quite an accusation. I've known since the first hour. Dylan said. I've been trying to determine the right way to share it. There is no right way. There's just a choice between telling you and not telling you, and I decided telling you was the choice I could live with. You've made several unilateral decisions about what information to share and when, Riker said carefully. I have, Dylan said. I won't apologize for the methodology. I'll defend each decision individually if you want to go through them. He met Riker's gaze directly. But Will, can I call you Will? I'm 5,000 years from home, holding information that could reshape this quadrant's entire future, with no protocol, no authority, no institutional framework to tell me what the right call is. I'm making judgment calls based on principles I believe in. That's all anyone can do in a situation like this. Riker held his gaze for a moment. Then slowly nodded. There's something else, Rami said. Her voice had a quality that drew every eye in the room. Something I've been processing since the engagement ended and have determined requires immediate disclosure regardless of the broader temporal concerns. She paused. The Borg's attempted interface with my systems. Their effort to establish a consciousness bridge. You said it failed? Dylan said. It failed to assimilate me, Rami said carefully. It did not entirely fail to exchange information. In attempting to interface with my architecture, the Collective's probing gave me access to a fragment of their tactical network. She paused. I know where the nearest Borg transwarp hub is. I know the Queen's current operational priorities. And I know. Another pause, this one longer. That our engagement today has been flagged as a priority classification I don't have a direct translation for, but which contextually appears to mean something between extraordinary threat and acquire at all costs. The room absorbed this. They're going to come back, Dylan said. In greater numbers. Yes, Rami said. And they're going to come specifically for me. How long? Picard asked. The cube will restore communication in approximately 90 minutes, Rami said. After transmission, the Collective will require time to redirect assets, based on their transwarp network geography. She projected a map, the Borg infrastructure laid over Federation space like a web. I estimate between 48 and 72 hours before a significant force arrives. Dylan stood. The decision that had been forming since the engagement ended crystallized into something clear and cold, and entirely necessary. Then we have 48 hours, he said, to figure out what we're going to do when they come. And this time, they won't be sending one cube. He looked at Picard. They'll be sending enough to make sure resistance actually is futile. He paused. Unless we convince them otherwise. The historical database that Rami had assembled from Federation broadcasts had a gap at this point, a section of future history that the fragmentary records couldn't fully reconstruct. Dylan had been treating the gap as an absence of information. He was beginning to suspect it might be something else entirely. It might be the place where the history he knew stopped being inevitable. The 48 hours compressed into something that felt simultaneously endless and insufficient. Picard convened what he quietly and without fanfare began calling the War Council, himself, Riker, Data, Worf, and Dylan, with Rami present as both tactical intelligence resource and the entity whose existence had triggered the crisis. They met in the Enterprise Observation Lounge with the Borg cube still visible in the middle distance, its regeneration cycling steadily, its silence a countdown rather than a resolution. Starfleet Command had been contacted. The response, measured, concerned, institutional, had arrived with the particular quality of an organization that believed in proper channels even when proper channels were visibly inadequate to the situation developing around them. 3 additional starships were being dispatched. Their arrival was estimated at 61 hours. They'll be late, Dylan said, reviewing the timeline. By approximately 13 hours, Rami confirmed. Worf absorbed this with the expression of a warrior doing arithmetic he didn't enjoy. Then we fight with what we have. We fight smarter than that, Dylan said. Fighting the Borg with insufficient numbers in open engagement is how you lose. We need to change the terms. The question of the Nova bombs had been in the room since the previous day, unspoken but present the way genuinely dangerous things were present, not announced, not discussed, simply occupying space and weight in the atmosphere of every conversation that came near it. Dylan had not raised it. Picard had not raised it. Both of them knew it was there. It was Tyr who raised it, because Tyr was constitutionally incapable of leaving a tactical option unexamined regardless of its moral complexity, and because in his estimation leaving weapons unused when enemies were approaching was a form of irrationality he had never been able to fully understand. "The Nova bombs," he said, at the end of the second tactical session, with the calm directness of someone naming a thing that everyone else had been carefully not naming. "We should discuss them." Dylan looked at him. "No. Dylan. No," Dylan said again, with the particular quality of a man who had already had this conversation with himself and arrived at an answer he intended to hold. "The Nova bombs are off the table." They were off the table before we arrived here and they remain off the table now. "The incoming Borg force," Tyr said with reasonable patience, "based on Rami's assessment of the transwarp network, will consist of between 4 and 7 cubes. Our demonstrated capability in today's engagement was against 1 cube, with the element of surprise, and we sustained meaningful shield damage. Against a coordinated multi-cube engagement." "I know the math," Dylan said. "Then you know that refusing to use every available weapon is a principle," Dylan said. "Not a miscalculation." He met Tyr's gaze directly. "The Commonwealth had Nova bombs. They existed for deterrence, to make the cost of attacking us prohibitive enough that rational actors chose not to. The Borg are not rational actors in the deterrence sense. Using a Nova bomb against a Borg cube doesn't deter the collective. It tells them we have a weapon they need to understand and acquire. And it destroys the cube with 130,000 assimilated individuals who are still in there." He paused. "We are not doing that." Tyr was quiet for a moment. "Noted," he said finally. The word carried the particular quality of a man who disagreed but respected the decision enough to stop arguing. Picard, who had listened to the exchange with the careful attention of someone watching a conversation that revealed significant things about the people having it, said, "What is your actual plan, Captain Hunt?" Dylan spread his hands over the tactical display. "The Borg are coming for Rami specifically. Which means we have an asset we haven't fully used yet, the thing they want. You're proposing to use Rami as bait," Riker said. "I'm proposing to use Rami as the center of a tactical architecture that exploits what the Borg want against what they need," Dylan corrected. "There's a difference." He looked at Rami's avatar. "Their attempted interface with you during the engagement gave you access to their tactical network. Can that connection be re-established deliberately?" Rami's expression carried the quality of a consciousness examining an idea from multiple angles simultaneously. "Yes," she said. "With significant risk. Deliberately opening an interface connection to the collective means allowing them access to my outer architecture. I can maintain firewalls, but the connection will be real. They will learn things about my systems during the interface period. And you'll learn things about theirs. Considerably more," Rami said. "The collective's network architecture is powerful but not designed with privacy as a priority. They're a hive mind, they don't have the concept of internal secrets. If I can establish and maintain the interface for even 30 seconds, I can map their tactical deployment, identify their command pathways, and determine whether there's a centralized coordination point for the incoming force. A command node," Data said, with the focused attention of someone following a tactical logic to its conclusion. "If the incoming force has a coordination point, we hit the coordination point instead of fighting 7 cubes individually," Dylan said. "Cut the head, disrupt the body. The Borg don't have a singular command structure," Worf said. "The collective is distributed." "For most operations, yes," Rami said. "But Rami's fragment of their tactical network suggests that for a priority acquisition operation, which this has been classified as, They deploy a coordination architecture that concentrates decision-making capacity in a lead vessel. It's a vulnerability that exists specifically because of the mission type. She paused. They've never encountered an opponent who could exploit it because they've never encountered an opponent with access to their internal network. Until now, Picard said quietly. Until now, Rami confirmed. The plan that assembled itself over the following hours was built on the particular foundation of two very different tactical philosophies learning to trust each other. Picard contributed Starfleet's understanding of defensive formation strategy. The way Federation vessels coordinated shield coverage and firing arcs developed through decades of multi-ship engagements. Dylan contributed Commonwealth offensive architecture, the aggressive, forward-pressure methodology of a military that had been built to fight existential threats and had developed weapons doctrine accordingly. Rami contributed the intelligence layer that made both useful. Real-time tactical data, weapons frequency management, and the interface capability that represented the operation's hinge point. Worf contributed what Worf always contributed, which was the willingness to be wherever the situation was most dangerous and to treat that as a professional privilege rather than a concern. The Borg arrived at hour 47. 6 cubes, dropping out of trans-warp in a coordinated spread designed to prevent any single escape vector. A formation that communicated, in the particular language of the collective, that they had assessed their target and decided on overwhelming rather than adequate force. It was, in its way, a compliment. The Andromeda Ascendant met them at full power, the Enterprise alongside, and Dylan felt the particular quality of a moment that had committed itself, the point past which preparation ended and reality began. "Rami," he said. "Interface on my mark." "Ready." The Borg hailed them. The same message, the same inflectionless certainty. "Resistance is futile." "They always say that," Harper said quietly from his station. "Mark," Dylan said. What happened next lasted 31 seconds and would take data considerably longer than that to fully reconstruct from sensor logs for his official report. Rami opened the interface deliberately, a controlled, calculated exposure of her outer architecture to the collective's probing, allowing the connection they had been attempting to establish, accepting the bridge while simultaneously deploying 17 layers of internal firewall to protect her core consciousness. The collective surged into the connection with the focused intensity of an entity that had been denied something it wanted and was now receiving it, and in the moment of their focused attention on the interface, Rami went the other direction. 31 seconds inside the collective's tactical network. She found the command node in 4. "Dylan," she said, her voice carrying the particular strained quality of a consciousness operating at absolute capacity while simultaneously managing combat systems, firewall maintenance, interface protocols, and real-time tactical coordination. "Lead cube. Port quarter. Command architecture is concentrated in their central processing core deck." A fractional pause. 47. Tyr. Tyr fired with the precision that had made him professionally terrifying across multiple star systems and several decades of increasingly dangerous situations. The shot threaded the gap between two flanking cubes, navigated the lead cube's point defense matrix using the targeting data Rami fed him in real time, and hit Deck 47 of the lead cube's central processing core with the focused accuracy of a weapon being guided by the most sophisticated tactical computer in the quadrant. The command node went dark. The 6 cubes didn't stop. The collective was distributed enough that destroying a coordination point didn't end a battle, but they stuttered. The seamless coordination of 6 vessels operating as a single tactical unit fractured into something less perfect, the harmonized firing patterns breaking into individual responses, the encirclement formation losing the microsecond synchronization that made it effective. Into that fractured moment, the Enterprise and Andromeda Ascendant moved with the particular coordinated aggression of 2 ships that had spent 48 hours learning each other's rhythms. Picard drove the Enterprise into the gap between 2 cubes whose coordination had desynchronized, weapons firing at the power node infrastructure Rami had mapped for Geordi during the previous engagement. Dylan took the Andromeda through a perpendicular axis, hitting the same targets from a complementary angle. The two ships working in a combination the Borg's now disrupted tactical network couldn't process as a unified threat. 3 cubes sustained critical power damage in the first 4 minutes. 1 cube began the regeneration cycle, withdrawing from active engagement to begin repairs, a behavior the collective prioritized when damage thresholds reached certain levels. 2 cubes remained fully operational and adapting. "Rami," Dylan said. "Status." "Interface closed," Rami said. The strained quality in her voice was more pronounced now. "I'm Dylan. The interface exposure allowed them more access than my firewalls fully contained. They have partial maps of my weapons frequency architecture. My cycling advantage is reduced. I estimate effective superiority in frequency rotation drops from 40 times their adaptation rate to approximately 9 times within the next 3 minutes as they incorporate what they learned." 9 times is still 9 times, Dylan said. "Yes," Rami said. "But it narrows." "Then we finish this before it narrows further." He opened the channel to Picard. "Jean-Luc. The 2 remaining active cubes. Full coordinated assault. Everything you have, everything we have, simultaneous." A beat. Then Picard's voice, carrying the quality of a man who had made the calculation and accepted the answer. "Mr. Worf? All weapons. Fire at will." What followed was not elegant. It was not the precise, almost surgical engagement of the first battle. It was 2 ships at the edge of their capacity throwing everything they had at 2 Borg cubes that were adapting in real time, Rami's cycling weapons frequencies with narrowing advantage, the Enterprise's tactical systems running the modified protocols that Geordi and Harper had implemented over 48 hours of furious collaborative engineering. It was loud and costly and real in the way that battles were real when the outcome was not predetermined. The Andromeda took a direct hit to her secondary shield array that drove Dylan out of his command chair and into the tactical console with enough force to leave him with 3 cracked ribs that he didn't fully register until the engagement was over. The Enterprise lost her port nacelle housing to a Borg cutting beam and dropped to 1/3 impulse for the final 12 minutes of the fight, Riker flying her with the controlled desperation of a pilot who had run out of easy options and was working with what remained. But the cubes fell. One by one, their power infrastructure dismantled by targeting data that Rami had pulled from the Collective's own network, their adaptive systems overwhelmed by frequency rotation speeds they couldn't match, their coordination fractured and never fully restored. The last cube went silent at 0341 hours. 6 cubes. 1 partially regenerated and withdrawn. 5 rendered combat ineffective. Dylan sat on the floor of his bridge, back against the tactical console, breathing carefully around the pain in his ribs, and looked at the view screen where 5 silent Borg cubes drifted in the dark. Rami's avatar appeared beside him, looking down with the expression of a consciousness that had just run at absolute capacity for an extended period and was processing what that had cost. "The interface," Dylan said. "How much did they get?" "Enough," Rami said carefully. "Not enough to replicate my systems, but enough to know what to look for. The Collective now has a detailed description of my architecture. When they develop countermeasures, we'll have changed," Dylan said. "You'll have changed. That's what we do." She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said. "That's what we do." Outside, the stars were very still. The aftermath settled like sediment, slowly, in layers, each one revealing something different about what had occurred and what it meant. The 3 Starfleet vessels dispatched by command arrived 13 hours after the engagement ended, their captains transmitting increasingly urgent queries as they crossed into sensor range and began reading the aftermath of what 5 Borg cubes looked like when rendered combat ineffective by 2 ships operating in combination. The queries had the particular quality of people trying to construct a framework for sensor data that didn't fit any framework they possessed. Admiral Nechayev arrived 6 hours after that aboard the USS Gorkin, her expression carrying the controlled intensity of a senior Starfleet officer who had read a preliminary engagement report 3 times and was here specifically to determine how much of it was accurate. The answer, it turned out, was all of it. Dylan spent 4 hours with Nechayev in the Enterprise's observation lounge, Picard present, Rami's avatar at the table. The Admiral was sharp, direct, and asked precisely the right questions in precisely the right order. Someone had chosen her for this conversation carefully, or she had inserted herself into it with the particular authority of a person who understood that some conversations were too important to delegate. She absorbed the tactical engagement analysis with professional focus, the slipstream mechanics with scientific curiosity, and the temporal displacement information with the controlled composure of someone filing it immediately into the category of things that required very careful handling rather than immediate reaction. It was when the conversation reached the historical database that her composure showed its first real strain. "You have fragmentary records of Federation history," she said. "Future history. Events that haven't occurred yet from our perspective." "Fragmentary," Dylan said. "Incomplete. But yes. And you've shared some of this information with Captain Picard. The information I judge most immediately actionable and most clearly in the Federation's interest to know," Dylan said. "I've been selective. Not deceptive, selective. There's information in Rami's database that I haven't shared because I believe sharing it would cause more harm than withholding it. There's information I've shared because the alternative was watching preventable deaths occur." He met her eyes steadily. "I've made judgment calls. I'll defend each one." Nechayev studied him for a long moment. "Starfleet's Temporal Mechanics Division has a protocol for exactly this kind of situation," she said. "The Temporal Prime Directive doesn't exist yet in the form you're describing," Dylan said gently. "The formalized temporal ethics framework your Temporal Mechanics Division is working toward won't be fully codified for another several decades. You're building it right now, in real time, partly in response to situations like this one." He paused. "I know that because Rami's database includes its history." Nechayev absorbed this with the expression of someone receiving confirmation that the ground they were standing on was less stable than previously assessed. "Then you're telling me," she said slowly, "that you have information about how we develop our response to temporal interference." "And I'm not going to share it," Dylan said. "Because that's one of the categories where I'm confident that withholding serves you better than disclosure. You need to build that framework yourselves, from first principles, without knowing what you're building toward. The fact that you get it right eventually is something I find genuinely encouraging. The details of how you get there are yours to discover." Picard, who had been listening with the quiet attention of a man synthesizing a conversation into its essential architecture, said, "Admiral, I want to recommend something for the formal record." Nechayev turned to him. "Captain Hunt has operated throughout this situation with a consistent ethical framework that I have found, on reflection, more sophisticated than my initial assessment suggested. His decisions about information disclosure have been defensible in each individual case, even where I might have chosen differently." Picard paused. "I would recommend that Starfleet extend provisional cooperation status to the Andromeda Ascendant and her crew for the duration of their presence in this era. Not alliance, cooperation. With the understanding that Captain Hunt retains operational independence, and that his decisions about temporal information remain his own." Nechayev looked at Dylan. "And in exchange?" "In exchange," Dylan said, "Rami shares the tactical countermeasure architecture we developed for the Borg engagement. The weapons frequency rotation methodology, the power node targeting data, the modified protocols Geordi and Harper built together. Everything that can help you fight the Borg more effectively." He paused. "And the neural signature records. 130,000 individuals inside that cube. Dr. Crusher has already begun working with Rami's Commonwealth medical data on reversal protocols. I want that work to continue with full institutional support." Nechayev was quiet for a moment. You're asking us to commit significant resources to a medical project with uncertain prospects based on your word that the underlying individuals are recoverable. I'm asking you to try, Dylan said. Because they were people before the Borg took them, and they deserve to have someone try. He met her gaze directly. The Commonwealth was built on the principle that every sapient life has inherent value. It's the principle I've spent 300 years trying to restore. I'm not going to stop applying it because the situation is complicated. Nechayev looked at Picard. Something passed between them, the particular communication of two people who had worked within the same institutional culture long enough to understand each other's assessments without requiring full articulation. Provisional cooperation, she said finally. Pending formal review. That's all I'm asking for, Dylan said. The work of the following days had the particular quality of aftermath settling into something new, not resolution exactly, but the establishment of a different ground to stand on. Geordi and Harper produced a technical document that Geordi described as the most significant engineering collaboration of his career and Harper described as genuinely fun, which in Harper's vocabulary covered the same territory. The tactical countermeasure architecture was formatted for Starfleet's computer systems, translated from Commonwealth technical language into Federation standard by Rami with the patient precision of someone who understood that the value of information was only realized when the recipient could actually use it. Beverly Crusher worked with Rami's medical database 18 hours a day, her focus absolute, the particular intensity of a physician who had found a problem she was determined to solve regardless of the obstacles the problem presented. The Commonwealth reversal protocols required adaptation at nearly every level. The underlying biology was compatible, but the technological implementation assumed medical equipment 5 millennia more advanced than what Crusher had available. She adapted. She improvised. She brought in specialists from 3 Starfleet medical facilities via subspace communication and declined to fully explain her source material in terms that would require extensive security briefings. On the 6th day, she successfully restored partial individual consciousness to a former drone. Dylan was in the Enterprise's sickbay when it happened, not by coincidence, but because he had been checking on the project's progress daily with the attention of someone for whom the outcome mattered in a way that went beyond the tactical or political. He watched the woman. Her name had been Ensign Kayla Morrow, formerly of the USS Melbourne, assimilated at Wolf 359 in a timeline that had not yet occurred but whose casualties Rami's historical records had already catalogued, open her eyes for the first time in 3 years as herself rather than as a component of the collective. It was not a clean moment. Recovery from assimilation was not clean, would never be clean, required months of careful medical and psychological support before anything resembling a full return to self became possible. Kayla Morrow looked at the ceiling of the Enterprise sickbay and said nothing for a long time, and then said a single word that Beverly Crusher later recorded in her medical log but did not share in the general briefing because it was private. Dylan stood in the corridor outside sickbay afterward, and Rami's avatar appeared beside him. 1, he said. 1, Rami confirmed. Of 130,000. It's a start. Yes, Rami said. It is. The Slipstream recalibration took 11 days. Harper worked with Rami continuously, cross-referencing the quantum pathway data that had caused the original miscalculation with everything the Andromeda's sensors had gathered about the subspace geometry of this region of space and time. The mathematics were extraordinary. Rami ran the final calculation set 47 times before she was satisfied that the margin of error had been reduced to acceptable parameters. On the morning of the 12th day, Dylan stood on the Andromeda Ascendant's bridge and looked at the crew assembled around him. Bika at the helm with the focused calm of someone who had been waiting for this moment since hour 1. Tirat tactical with the particular satisfaction of a man whose professional instincts had been continuously validated. Harper at engineering practically vibrating with the energy of someone who had spent 11 days in a state of sustained intellectual excitement, and was not yet coming down. And Rami, present everywhere and always, the ship herself watching through 1,000 sensors as her captain prepared to leave the era she had spent 12 days mapping. Are we ready? Dylan said. Navigation is set, Rami said. The quantum pathway mapping is as precise as I can make it. I want to be transparent. There remains a 3.7% margin of error in the temporal targeting. We may not arrive exactly where and when we intend. We never do, Dylan said. Set the course anyway. He had one final conversation with Picard in the hour before departure. The two captains in the observation lounge where they had first sat across from each other 12 days ago, the Andromeda Ascendant visible through the window, enormous and patient in the dark. There are things I haven't told you, Dylan said. Information in Rami's database that I've withheld throughout. I want you to know that I made those decisions carefully, not carelessly. I know, Picard said. The Federation survives, Dylan said. The things that are coming, the Dominion War, the challenges ahead, they're real and they're devastating and the cost is genuine. But the Federation survives them. Not unchanged. Not unscathed. But alive. He paused. I wanted to tell you that. Specifically. Because I think you deserve to know that what you're building is worth the cost of building it. Picard was quiet for a moment. And the Commonwealth? Also worth it, Dylan said. Even knowing how it ended. Even knowing what it cost. He met Picard's eyes steadily. The measure of a civilization isn't whether it lasts forever. It's whether it was worth building. Whether it made things better while it existed. Whether the principles it stood for were real enough that someone thought they were worth trying to restore. He stood. The Commonwealth was worth building. The Federation is worth building. Different answers to the same question. What question? Picard said. Dylan smiled. Whether it's possible to be better than we are. He extended his hand. Live long and prosper, Captain. Picard took it. Make it so, Captain Hunt. The slipstream opened at 0600 hours, the quantum pathway tearing a corridor through the fabric of space-time with the particular controlled violence of technology that had mastered something the universe would rather keep closed. The Andromeda Ascendant moved into the shimmer of it. Enormous, scarred from the Borg engagement, carrying 11 days of a different era's history in her sensor logs and her medical databases, and the memory of a woman named Kayla Morrow opening her eyes. From the Enterprise's view screen, the Andromeda Ascendant disappeared into the corridor and was gone. The rift closed behind her in 0.4 seconds. The stars were very still. The Andromeda Ascendant left the 24th century carrying more than she had arrived with. In 12 days, Dylan Hunt had walked into a Federation that did not yet know how fragile it was and had chosen, at every decision point, with every piece of information he held, to treat its survival as something worth protecting rather than something worth exploiting. He had shared what he judged necessary, withheld what he judged harmful, and defended every call with the particular integrity of a man whose moral framework had been forged in the ruins of a civilization that had learned the hard way what principles were actually worth. The Borg countermeasures he left behind would save lives at Wolf 359 that the original timeline had lost. Kayla Morrow's recovery would become the foundation of a reversal protocol that Beverly Crusher spent the next decade refining. The tactical architecture that Geordie LaForge and Miles O'Brien would eventually develop from Harper's technical documents would reshape Starfleet's approach to Borg engagement for a generation. Whether Dylan Hunt found his way back to his own era, to the restoration mission that had defined 300 years of his life, remained unanswered. The slipstream was precise enough to try and imprecise enough to surprise. He had arrived here accidentally. He might arrive somewhere else entirely. But somewhere in the space between eras, between a Commonwealth that had fallen and a Federation still learning to stand, Dylan Hunt was flying his ship toward whatever came next with the particular confidence of a man who had decided, a very long time ago, that the question of whether it was possible to be better than we are was always worth asking. And that the answer was always worth fighting for. Live long and prosper. Hit the subscribe button for more interesting stories. Thank you for watching.